The scent of grilled burgers and sizzling sausages hung in the warm evening air, mingling with the sweet smell of charcoal smoke. The sun had just begun to dip behind the trees, casting a soft golden glow over the backyard. The sound of laughter echoed around the garden as the family of five, Mark, his wife Sophie, their two teenage kids, and his younger sister Claire, enjoyed a laid-back Saturday barbecue. It was the kind of night they all looked forward to, a break from the usual hustle and bustle of their busy lives. Mark flipped a burger on the grill with a careful hand, watching it sizzle and shrink as it browned. Sophie, ever the hostess, passed around plates, while Claire chatted with the kids about school. The kids, Ben and Emma, were so used to these evenings that they felt right at home in their backyard, no worries, just pure fun. "I swear, Dad, you're turning into a professional grill master," Ben laughed, stealing a piece of grilled corn from the platter Sophie was holding. Mark chuckled and wiped his hands on the apron. "I have to keep the family fed, don't I?" he joked, clearly proud of his cooking skills. The sound of clinking glasses mixed with the rhythm of conversation, but suddenly, it was interrupted by the unmistakable wail of sirens. The sirens were faint at first, but they grew louder, closer, until the unmistakable red and blue lights filled the street. Mark froze. His grip tightened on the tongs. Sophie looked up, her smile slipping. "Do you think it's us?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Ben looked toward the street. "Is it a fire truck?" But the flashing lights weren't from a fire truck. It was two police cars, pulling up to the curb, their lights flashing and illuminating the front yard. The sound of the sirens grew louder until they came to a screeching halt. The family exchanged puzzled glances. Who would call the cops on a peaceful barbecue? "I'll go check it out," Mark said, his voice suddenly flat. Sophie raised an eyebrow, but Mark had already taken a few steps toward the gate. The kids' laughter had faltered as the unexpected police presence cast a shadow over the evening's joy. Mark's footsteps were measured as he approached the officers, who had now begun to exit their patrol cars. There were three of them, a man and two women, and all of them were looking around, confused. As Mark reached the driveway, the lead officer, a woman with short, blonde hair, turned toward him. "Is this your property, sir?" she asked, her tone formal but not unfriendly. "Yes, it is." "What's going on? Is there a problem?" Mark asked, trying to hide the unease that had settled in his chest. "We received a noise complaint. Neighbors said there was excessive noise coming from this property," she replied, eyeing the backyard where the kids were still talking and laughing. "Is everything all right here?" Sophie had followed Mark up to the gate now, her arms crossed, visibly worried. The kids stood at the window, watching curiously from behind the curtains. Mark's gaze flickered toward the neighbor's house, the source of the complaint. Mrs. Johnson, the woman next door, had always been a stickler for noise. He hadn't thought it was bad enough to warrant a call to the police, but then again, Mrs. Johnson had never been the type to let things slide. "Excessive noise?" Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel his heart rate pick up. It was one of those rare moments when things just didn't seem to fit together, but he couldn't put his finger on why. The officer seemed to notice the confusion in his voice. "Yes. The complaint said that there was a lot of shouting and music being played. It's not common for your neighborhood to get this kind of call." Mark glanced back at Sophie, who shrugged as if she, too, was trying to make sense of it all. "Look, there's no issue here. We're just having a quiet family gathering." "I'll turn the music down if that's what's bothering her," Mark said, trying to defuse the situation. The officer nodded, but she didn't move to leave. Instead, she looked at Mark, then back at her partner. The unease in her eyes was obvious, and Mark's mind started to race. There was something wrong. Something beyond the usual complaint. His stomach twisted. Without warning, the lead officer's voice crackled through her radio. She turned slightly, holding her hand to her earpiece. Unit 3, do you have confirmation on the identity of the homeowner? The radio buzzed with static for a moment before a response came through. Copy that. Mark Reynolds, 42, Police Chief of Sandbrook City. The air seemed to go still. Mark felt his heart skip a beat. Sophie froze, her eyes widening in shock. What did you say? She asked, her voice barely audible. The officer repeated the information, her gaze flickering back to Mark. Mark Reynolds. You are the new police chief of Sandbrook City? Mark didn't answer right away. The name, the title, hung in the air, thick with disbelief. Yes. I am, Mark said finally, his voice steady but laced with tension. The officers looked between each other, their surprise evident, though they tried not to show it. The officer who had been speaking to him took a small step back, her expression a mix of respect and confusion. Sophie looked at Mark, her eyes searching his face for answers, but he remained silent. The officers exchanged another look. We had no idea. We just got this call about noise, and the address, it didn't match what we expected, the officer admitted. Mark nodded, his face unreadable. I understand. But there's no need for the police to be involved. It was just a family barbecue. I'll take care of it. With that, he turned to head back toward the grill. Sophie followed him, her face flushed with both confusion and surprise. The officers stood motionless for a moment, then, after a final glance at Mark, they turned to leave. As the police cars drove off, the neighborhood returned to its quiet, pre-barbecue normalcy. But the moment the front door shut behind them, Sophie turned to Mark, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me? Mark looked at her, his jaw tight. He hadn't planned on telling anyone, especially not her. It had been something he had kept under wraps for years. But now, there was no going back. It wasn't the right time, he said, his voice low. Sophie stared at him, trying to process the shocking revelation. She had known him for years, had been married to him for 15 of them, and never once had he mentioned his position. She had no idea her husband was not only part of the city's police force but the chief of it. Ben and Emma stood in the doorway now, their faces a mirror of confusion. Are you the police chief, Dad? Ben asked, his voice loud with curiosity. Mark took a deep breath, knowing there was no easy way to answer. Yes, Ben. I am. But as the family stood there in stunned silence, Mark knew that this small revelation was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would unravel everything they thought they knew about each other and the world around them. The backyard was quiet now. The sound of sizzling meat and the laughter of children had faded into the distance, replaced by the tense silence that hung heavily between Mark and Sophie. It had been over an hour since the police cars had left, but neither of them had spoken much since then. The kids had gone back inside, sensing the tension in the air. Mark stood by the grill, staring at the charred remains of the burgers. His mind was elsewhere, still racing from the shocking moment earlier. How could he have kept this secret for so long? And why now? Why had his position been exposed in such an abrupt, public way? Sophie finally broke the silence. She hadn't moved since she'd last spoken. She stood at the kitchen counter, her back to Mark, trying to compose herself. Her words, when they came, were calm but laced with disbelief. So, all this time, you've been the police chief? She asked, her voice soft but sharp. Mark's eyes remained on the grill. Yes, he replied, his voice low. For 3 years now. Sophie turned around, her eyes wide. But why didn't you tell me, Mark? Why didn't you say anything? He didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the grill for support. He had always known this day would come, but never like this. It wasn't just the shock of his position being revealed that bothered him, it was the fact that Sophie had been kept in the dark about something so crucial to his life. Because it wasn't necessary, Mark said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. I didn't want to worry you. The job isn't easy, Sophie. It's not something I wanted to bring home. Sophie took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. Not bring home? Mark, we're married. We share everything. I had no idea you were living this double life. All this time, you've been running the police department, and her voice caught in her throat. I didn't even know. Mark winced, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he had expected. He turned to face her, finally locking eyes. It's not a double life, Sophie. It's complicated. Complicated, she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. How is this complicated? You've been the police chief for 3 years, and you didn't think to tell your wife? Do you have any idea what this does to me? The secrecy, the lies. It's not lies, Mark interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. It's about protecting you, protecting the family. Being in my position, there are things I can't talk about. Things I can't share. If you knew half of what I deal with every day, I'd what? Sophie snapped, her patience starting to unravel. I'd what, Mark? Be able to handle it? You don't trust me, do you? All this time, I thought we were partners. I thought we were a team. But you've kept me in the dark, and for what? So you could play the hero? I don't know who you are anymore. Mark felt his chest tighten at her words. The pain in her voice was like a punch to the gut. He had always believed he was doing the right thing by keeping his job separate from their personal life. But now, standing in the kitchen with Sophie's tear-filled eyes locked on him, he realized how wrong he had been. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for it to be this way. Sophie didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her arms folded tightly across her chest. After a moment, she finally spoke, her voice quieter now but still filled with emotion. Why didn't you trust me with this, Mark? Why didn't you think I could handle it? Sophie's expression softened slightly, but there was still a coldness in her eyes. Well, you didn't protect me, Mark. You shut me out. And now, I feel like I don't even know you. Mark swallowed hard, his throat tight. He knew she was right. He had made a mistake. He had built walls around himself, believing it was the best thing for everyone, but in reality, he had pushed away the one person who mattered most. How long has this been going on, Mark? Sophie asked, her voice steady but with an edge of pain. How long have you been hiding this from me? 3 years, he answered, his gaze dropping to the floor. 3 years since I became police chief. And I thought I could keep it separate. I thought I could compartmentalize it. But things got complicated. The longer I waited, the harder it became to tell you. Sophie shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You've been lying to me for 3 years, Mark. And now, you expect me to just accept it? I don't expect you to accept anything, Sophie, Mark said, his voice low and regretful. I just want to make things right. I never meant to hurt you. I thought if I kept you out of it, I'd be keeping you safe. But now I see how wrong I was. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Mark asked, his voice a little panicked. I need space, Mark, she said without looking back. I need to think. Mark watched her leave, his heart heavy with regret. He had never wanted this, to drive the woman he loved away. But the truth was, he didn't know how to fix this. He had made a mess of everything, and now, he had no idea how to clean it up. Later that night the silence in the house was deafening. Mark had spent the entire evening alone, pacing around the living room, trying to figure out how to make things right. He hadn't heard from Sophie since she left. The kids, sensing the tension between their parents, had quietly gone to bed. It was just him now, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. As the hours passed, Mark found himself staring at the framed family photos on the wall. He saw their smiling faces from years ago, before all of this. Before the job, before the lies. Back when everything felt simple. Back when he could be just a husband and a father. He picked up his phone and glanced at the screen. There were several missed calls from Sophie. His stomach twisted. He hadn't wanted to answer, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what to say. How could he fix this? Sophie's expression softened slightly, but there was still a coldness in her eyes. Well, you didn't protect me, Mark. You shut me out. And now, I feel like I don't even know you. Mark swallowed hard, his throat tight. He knew she was right. He had made a mistake. He had built walls around himself, believing it was the best thing for everyone, but in reality, he had pushed away the one person who mattered most. How long has this been going on, Mark? Sophie asked, her voice steady but with an edge of pain. How long have you been hiding this from me? 3 years, he answered, his gaze dropping to the floor. 3 years since I became police chief. And I thought I could keep it separate. I thought I could compartmentalize it. But things got complicated. The longer I waited, the harder it became to tell you. Sophie shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You've been lying to me for 3 years, Mark. And now, you expect me to just accept it? I don't expect you to accept anything, Sophie, Mark said, his voice low and regretful. I just want to make things right. I never meant to hurt you. I thought if I kept you out of it, I'd be keeping you safe. But now I see how wrong I was. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Mark asked, his voice a little panicked. I need space, Mark, she said without looking back. I need to think. Mark watched her leave, his heart heavy with regret. He had never wanted this, to drive the woman he loved away. But the truth was, he didn't know how to fix this. He had made a mess of everything, and now, he had no idea how to clean it up. Later that night the silence in the house was deafening. Mark had spent the entire evening alone, pacing around the living room, trying to figure out how to make things right. He hadn't heard from Sophie since she left. The kids, sensing the tension between their parents, had quietly gone to bed. It was just him now, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. As the hours passed, Mark found himself staring at the framed family photos on the wall. He saw their smiling faces from years ago, before all of this. Before the job, before the lies. Back when everything felt simple. Back when he could be just a husband and a father. He picked up his phone and glanced at the screen. There were several missed calls from Sophie. His stomach twisted. He hadn't wanted to answer, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what to say. How could he fix this? But then, just as he was about to set the phone down, a message from Sophie popped up. I need to talk. Meet me at the park. Midnight. Mark's heart raced as he read the message. It was a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. He grabbed his jacket, slipped on his shoes, and headed out the door. The park was quiet at midnight, only the sound of the rustling leaves filling the air. Mark arrived at the entrance, scanning the area for Sophie. There she was, standing near the swings, her figure silhouetted against the dim lights of the park. Sophie, Mark called softly. She turned to face him. Her eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps hope, behind the exhaustion. I'm sorry, he said, walking toward her. I know I've messed up. I never should have kept this from you. But I promise, I never wanted to hurt you. Sophie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Mark, you can't keep secrets from me. Not anymore. I need to know who you really are. If we're going to move forward, there can't be any more lies. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I understand, he said, his voice steady. And I'm ready to tell you everything. No more secrets. Sophie's eyes softened slightly. Good. Because we've got a long road ahead of us. The park was empty now. The streetlights flickered above as Mark and Sophie sat on a bench, both of them facing forward, lost in their own thoughts. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that made the night feel heavier than it should. Sophie had asked Mark to meet her here because she needed answers, answers he wasn't sure he was ready to give. But they had to talk. They had to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Mark's hands were clenched tightly in his lap, the quiet almost deafening. Sophie hadn't said much after their brief exchange, her eyes remaining fixed on the distant trees. Mark knew she was processing everything, trying to make sense of what he had just told her. And as much as he wished he could go back and change everything, he knew that this was the only way forward, there was no more hiding. Do you regret it? Sophie's voice broke through the silence. Mark turned his head slowly to look at her. Her expression was calm, but there was a hint of something, vulnerability, fear. It was the first time she'd asked him something like this, and he wasn't sure how to answer. He didn't want to say the wrong thing. He didn't want to lose her. Do I regret, what? He asked, his voice soft. Do you regret keeping this from me? Do you regret all the secrets? Sophie repeated, her tone a mixture of sadness and frustration. Mark took a deep breath and exhaled, the weight of her question pressing down on him. I regret the way I handled things, he said finally. I should have told you earlier. I should have trusted you. But no, I don't regret being the police chief. It's not a job I take lightly. It's complicated. Sophie was silent for a moment. Mark could feel the tension between them, the heavy air filled with unspoken words. You said you wanted to protect me, Sophie said quietly. But in doing so, you pushed me away. You kept me in the dark for so long, Mark. And now, I feel like I don't know who you are anymore. Mark's heart clenched at her words. He hated that she felt this way, hated that his job, his commitment to protecting others, had caused this rift between them. Wanted to push you away. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it. I thought the less you knew, the safer you'd be. But I see now how wrong that was. I should have shared it with you. I should have trusted you with the truth. Sophie shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mark, this isn't just about the job. It's about everything. It's about the fact that you've been hiding things from me. The fact that I've been living with someone who wasn't fully honest with me. And now, I don't know if I can trust you anymore. Her words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. The pain in her voice was real, raw. He had always known that keeping secrets from her would eventually come to a head, but he hadn't realized the extent to which it would hurt her. He hadn't realized how deep the damage went. I understand, he said quietly. I know I've lost your trust. And I can't blame you for that. I've messed up, Sophie. I know I have. But I'm asking you to let me make it right. I'm asking you to give me a chance to rebuild that trust. Sophie looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something, an answer, a sign, a glimmer of the man she had once known. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but filled with pain. I don't know if I can do that, Mark. You've hurt me so much. I don't know if I can just forgive and forget like it's nothing. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect it to be easy. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll be honest with you. I'll share everything you want to know. No more lies. No more secrets. Sophie was quiet again, her gaze shifting to the ground. Mark felt the weight of her silence. He knew that what he was asking wasn't easy, that this wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. But he also knew that it was the only way forward. Finally, Sophie sighed, her shoulders slumping with the weight of everything they had just discussed. Okay, she said softly. You can tell me everything. But I need time. I need time to process all of this, Mark. I can't just jump back into things like nothing happened. Mark's heart surged with relief. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward. Thank you, he whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. I just need you to know that I love you. And I'll fight for us, for this family. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She stood up from the bench and walked a few steps away, her back to him. Mark stood too, giving her space. He knew she needed it. As he stood there, watching Sophie take in the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The truth had been revealed, but there were still so many layers to peel back, so many things left unsaid. The police force, his position as chief, the cases he had worked on, there was more to the story than Sophie knew. And he wasn't sure how much he was ready to share. I'm not the man you thought I was, Mark said quietly, his voice rough. Sophie turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Then who are you, Mark? Who are you really? Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew the answer. But he wasn't sure he could explain it. Not yet. I'll show you, he said after a long pause. I'll show you who I really am. The next day, the morning after their conversation, the sun rose over the city with an eerie calm. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone as he scrolled through news updates. The phone in his hand felt heavier than usual, as if it carried a weight far beyond what it was designed for. He had to make a decision. Sophie had agreed to hear him out, but she had made it clear that trust had to be rebuilt. And that wasn't going to be easy. Not after everything he had hidden from her. Mark glanced up when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Sophie walked into the kitchen, her face pale but composed. She wasn't wearing her usual smile, but she wasn't angry either. She was quiet, as if still processing everything from last night. Do you want some coffee? Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophie nodded but didn't speak right away. She sat down across from him at the table and let out a slow breath. I've been thinking about what you said, Sophie began, her voice calm but serious. And I think it's time you tell me everything. All of it. If we're going to move forward, you need to open up completely. No more half-truths. No more hiding. Mark met her eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. I agree, he said, his voice low. There's a lot more you need to know. But I want to do this right. I want you to understand everything I've been through, everything I've had to deal with. It's not just a job, Sophie. It's a world I can't explain in a few words. Sophie's eyes softened a little, but there was still a guarded look there. I'm listening. Mark took a deep breath and began to speak. The story he was about to tell wasn't just about his job, it was about the sacrifices he had made. The things he had seen, the choices he had been forced to make. It was a story of darkness and light, of crime and justice, of the human cost of being in the position he was. As he spoke, Sophie sat quietly, listening. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he wasn't hiding. He felt like he was finally being honest. But deep down, he knew that the real test was yet to come. Would Sophie believe him? Would she accept the truth he was about to lay out for her? Part 4, Unraveling Secrets. The tension in the kitchen hung thick like smoke. Sophie was still sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around her cup of coffee, but her eyes were no longer focused on the swirling steam rising from the mug. She was looking at Mark, waiting, expecting him to continue his story. To tell her everything. Mark had started, but he had barely scratched the surface. Sophie had listened intently, her gaze never wavering as he spoke, but each revelation seemed to bring a new weight to the room. She had no idea how deep this went, how much Mark had buried inside him. As much as he wanted to be open with her, there were still pieces of the puzzle that he couldn't quite bring himself to share, not yet. The sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. It was late afternoon, and Mark felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had spent most of the morning recalling the events, the decisions that had led him to this point. Sophie's silence only made it harder. He had expected some anger, some frustration, but this was different. Her quietness was a wall. And behind that wall, he didn't know if he could reach her anymore. Sophie put the cup down slowly, her fingers lingering on the rim. "Mark, you've been avoiding the most important part," she said, her voice calm but with a sharp edge. "You keep saying things like, 'It's complicated,' but it's been days now. You promised me the truth. The whole truth. And we're still dancing around the heart of it." Mark felt his chest tighten. Sophie wasn't wrong. He had been evading the hard parts of his story, delaying the inevitable. But it was impossible to explain the full depth of his involvement without first explaining the choices he had made. The consequences of those choices had been monumental, and even now, he was struggling to fully comprehend the gravity of it all. He leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "It's not just about me, Sophie. I didn't just take on the role of police chief because it was a title. I didn't become who I am just because I wanted power. This job, these cases, they consume you. They change you. And sometimes, you have to make decisions that are not just hard, they're painful. They break you. And if you're not careful, you can lose sight of who you are." Sophie frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean by that? What decisions? What exactly did you do that's so bad?" "All I've heard is you dodging the question. I'm trying to understand, Mark, but you're making it impossible." Mark's throat tightened. He knew Sophie was trying, he could see it in the way her lips trembled slightly, as though she was trying not to show just how much this was affecting her. He had to be honest with her. He had no choice. "There was one case," Mark began, his voice heavy with the weight of the memory. "A few years ago, there was a drug cartel operating in the city. They were brutal, violent. They didn't just deal drugs, they destroyed families. They left a trail of devastation in their wake. And I was in charge of taking them down." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "You were the one leading the charge against them? That's a big responsibility." Mark nodded, his face grim. "Yeah. It was supposed to be a routine operation. But when we got close to capturing the cartel leaders, things went sideways. One of our informants tipped them off. We were ambushed in a warehouse. People died. Not just our officers, but innocent people. The cartel, they didn't care. They didn't see us as anything more than targets." Sophie's hand twitched, but she didn't say anything. Mark continued, his voice rough as he recalled the nightmare. "It was chaos. Absolute chaos. I lost men I cared about. And I had to make a choice, let them escape or risk more lives in a full-scale battle. I knew I couldn't let them go free. But I also knew that if we pressed too hard, more people would die. And I couldn't live with that." Sophie was staring at him now, her eyes wide. She seemed to be piecing things together. "So, what did you do?" she asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. I gave the order," Mark admitted, his voice strained. "I told my men to fall back. I let the cartel leaders slip away. I saved lives, but I let them go. I made the decision that kept more of us alive in the short term, but it destroyed everything we worked for. It made me look weak, indecisive." Sophie was silent, her face unreadable. "But that's not the end, is it?" she said softly, almost as a statement. Mark swallowed hard. No. It wasn't the end. A few months later, the cartel came back with a vengeance. They went after the families of the officers who had been involved in the operation. They targeted the people I cared about. Sophie, I've lost people because of that decision, people who didn't deserve it. Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Mark let them fall. And that's not even the worst of it. After everything happened, I was promoted. I became police chief. But I couldn't shake the guilt. I couldn't forget the faces of those who died because of my choice. I made a deal with the devil, Sophie. And it's eaten me alive ever since." Sophie's face softened, but there was still a tremor in her voice when she spoke. "Mark, why didn't you tell me any of this before? Why did you keep it all locked up inside?" Mark leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He felt the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. "Because I thought you'd look at me differently. Because I thought if I told you, you'd see me as the man who couldn't do his job. I couldn't let you see me as weak. I couldn't let anyone know how much it tore me apart. I had to be strong for everyone, especially for you." Sophie's eyes glistened, and for a moment, Mark thought she might finally break down. But instead, she reached out and placed her hand on top of his. The warmth of her touch sent a shock of relief through him. "I don't know what to say, Mark," Sophie whispered. "I'm trying to understand, but this is so much. It's not just a bad decision. It's a life-changing one. I don't know if I can fully comprehend the impact it's had on you." "I don't expect you to understand it all at once," Mark replied, his voice steadying. "I just want you to know that I never meant to hurt anyone. I never wanted to cause pain. But sometimes, the choices we make don't just affect us, they affect everyone around us." Sophie remained silent for a long time, her thumb gently brushing the back of his hand. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for her response, wondering if she would still be able to see him as the man she once loved. Finally, Sophie spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you for everything, Mark. But I need you to understand that this is going to take time. Trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight. And right now, I feel like I don't know who you are anymore." Mark nodded, the pain in his chest deepening. He had known it wasn't going to be easy, but hearing those words from Sophie felt like a cold slap to the face. He had hoped, no, prayed, that she would understand. But now, he wasn't sure what the future held. "I understand," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. But I need you to know this, Sophie. There's more to the story. I haven't even told you everything yet. There's still so much more you don't know." Sophie's gaze was hard now, almost distant. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Mark hesitated, the next words stuck in his throat. He had already shared so much, but he knew there was no turning back now. The truth was out. But it wasn't the whole truth. "There's a part of my job, something I've been involved in, that I haven't told you about," Mark said carefully, his voice almost faltering. "A part that's darker than anything I've shared with you so far." Sophie leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What are you talking about, Mark?" Mark swallowed hard. He had promised Sophie the truth, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what he was about to reveal. He took a deep breath. I've been working with people I shouldn't have. I've made deals with the wrong kind of people. And now, those decisions are coming back to haunt me. The tension in the air was palpable. Sophie's silence, after Mark's revelation, hung like a thick fog that neither of them could break through. She didn't know what to make of his words. The man she thought she knew, the one who had always been strong, dependable, and capable, was now admitting to things so dark, so twisted, that she couldn't process them all at once. Every piece of information Mark had shared felt like another layer being peeled off of him, revealing an entirely different person. A person she wasn't sure she could trust. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of it. Her mind raced, connecting dots, and yet, nothing seemed to fit. Mark's words echoed in her head, I've been working with people I shouldn't have. I've made deals with the wrong kind of people. And now, those decisions are coming back to haunt me. Mark watched her closely, his gaze never leaving her face, searching for some sign of understanding, or at least a glimpse of forgiveness. But Sophie's expression remained unreadable. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, until finally, Sophie spoke. Mark, she said, her voice soft but full of emotion, what kind of deals? What people? What exactly are you involved in? Mark didn't respond immediately. The weight of her question pressed down on him, and the answer seemed to lodge itself in his throat, unwilling to come out. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that his past, his decisions, were far from ordinary, and that eventually, Sophie would ask the hard questions. But no matter how many times he had run through this in his mind, he wasn't sure how to say it. He wasn't sure how to make her understand. Taking a deep breath, he spoke. When I became police chief, I was given access to cases and people that most officers never see. Things happen in the shadows, Sophie. There are crimes we can't investigate because they're too dangerous, too well connected. I was approached by people who had influence, who had the power to either help or destroy entire cases with just a word. They weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were businessmen, politicians, people in high places. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Her brow furrowed as she listened, the words feeling surreal. Businessmen? Politicians? This was far beyond anything she had imagined. Wait, she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly, you're telling me that you've been working with these people? People who have no business being involved with the police? Mark nodded, his face grim. Yes. But it wasn't just about working with them. They came to me with deals I thought I could control, deals that seemed harmless at first. But the further I went, the deeper I got pulled in. They offered resources, information, and support in exchange for favors. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. Favors? What kind of favors, Mark? You're a police officer. You're supposed to uphold the law, not make deals with people like this. Mark's face twisted with shame, but there was a bitterness in his voice when he spoke. It wasn't as simple as that, Sophie. At first, it seemed harmless. They wanted me to turn a blind eye to certain things, small things, like minor crimes being overlooked for the sake of business. Things I thought wouldn't harm anyone. But it didn't stay small. It escalated. They began asking for more. They wanted protection for their illegal activities. They wanted me to cover up investigations. And when I hesitated, they made it clear that there were consequences for crossing them. Sophie's mind reeled. This was not the Mark she knew. She had always believed that he was a man of integrity, someone who would never compromise his values. But now, she saw the cracks in that image, and the reality was far darker than she had ever expected. You're telling me you were blackmailed? She asked, her voice rising with disbelief. Mark looked away, unable to meet her gaze. It wasn't blackmail, exactly. They didn't threaten my life directly, but they knew how to play the game. They knew my weaknesses, my family, my career. And they used that knowledge against me. If I didn't play along, they could ruin everything. My career, my reputation, my ability to protect anyone. So I did what I had to do. Sophie could hear the shame in his voice, but it didn't make her feel any better. In fact, it made everything worse. How could she reconcile the man she loved with the man who had compromised his principles for the sake of convenience? How could she forgive him for putting them all at risk? The worst part, Mark continued, was when they made it clear that I could either protect my own or protect the city. They gave me a choice between saving my own skin and doing what was right. And in the end, I chose to protect myself. I chose to keep climbing, to keep taking their help, because I thought that if I stayed in power, I could eventually clean up the mess. But the truth is, Sophie, I got too comfortable. I was too focused on the career, on the power. I let it consume me. Sophie's hands were shaking now. She wanted to scream, to yell at him for what he had done, for the lies, for the betrayal. But there was a part of her that still wanted to understand. She wanted to know if this man, this Mark, was still the man she had once loved, or if he had become something else entirely. How many people have you hurt, Mark? Sophie's voice trembled with the weight of her question. How many lives have been ruined because of these deals? Mark swallowed hard. I don't know. I can't keep track. The further I went, the more I lost sight of who I was. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I just knew I had to keep moving forward, keep the job, keep the protection. It was a slippery slope. One bad choice led to another, and before I knew it, I was in too deep. Sophie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She was trembling, the weight of his words settling on her chest like a heavy burden. And now? What happens now, Mark? You think you can just walk away from this? That I can just forget everything you've done? Mark stood too, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm trying, Sophie. I'm trying to make it right. But I need you to understand, this isn't something I can fix overnight. I've made mistakes, I know that. But I'm here, I'm being honest with you now. I can't take it back, but I can try to make it better. Sophie turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. Do you really think this is something you can fix? That you can just explain it all away and I'll forgive you? This isn't a small mistake, Mark. This is a betrayal. It's a lifetime of lies. Mark's face tightened, the pain in his eyes clear. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want a chance. A chance to prove that I can be the man you thought I was. The man I used to be. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. Sophie took a step back, shaking her head. I don't know if I can trust you again, Mark. I don't even know if I can look at you the same way anymore. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had expected anger, maybe even rejection, but hearing Sophie say those words made the weight of everything he had done feel unbearable. He had known this was coming, he knew the consequences of his actions, but hearing Sophie, the one person he had hoped would understand, say those words made him question everything. I know I've hurt you, Mark said, his voice breaking. But I need you to know, no matter what happens, I'll always love you. And I'll keep trying, Sophie. I'll keep trying to make things right. Sophie didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there, staring at him, her face a mixture of sadness, confusion, and hurt. And Mark knew, in that moment, that the road ahead was going to be long, and he wasn't sure if they could ever come back from this. But he also knew one thing, he couldn't walk away now. He had already made the choice to fight for her. To fight for the woman he loved. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many mistakes he had made, he would keep fighting. The silence between Sophie and Mark grew heavy with each passing day, neither of them knowing exactly how to move forward. The atmosphere in their home felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves had become complicit in the secrets that hung between them. Despite the weight of their unresolved issues, Sophie had to face a reality she hadn't fully acknowledged until now: their lives were no longer just about their relationship. There was a far darker undercurrent to everything Mark had revealed, one that threatened to pull them both under. Sophie spent the next few days walking around in a fog, her thoughts in constant turmoil. Mark's confessions had shaken her to her core, but it wasn't just the lies that haunted her. It was the fact that those lies had been so deeply entangled with the very fabric of her life. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with everything, had been living a double life for years. She kept asking herself, what did I really know about him? Even now, as she tried to process everything, a piece of her still couldn't believe the gravity of his past. Mark had insisted that he was trying to make things right, that he was ready to leave the dangerous world he had been drawn into. But Sophie couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he was still hiding something, that the truth was more complicated than he was letting on. She spent hours scrolling through old police reports online, hoping to uncover something that would make sense of the confusion swirling in her mind. It was a futile attempt. Nothing could truly explain the mess they were in, but it gave her something to focus on, something to hold on to. Mark, meanwhile, continued his efforts to salvage whatever trust he could. Every time Sophie looked at him, though, she saw the man who had betrayed her, the man who had deceived her for so long. His words, no matter how sincere, didn't seem to make the past go away. One evening, Sophie decided to confront him again. She couldn't keep burying the unease that had taken root inside her. She found him in the living room, sitting at the desk, sorting through papers. He looked up as she entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He had been trying so hard to regain her trust, but it was clear that every conversation, every attempt, left them both more drained than before. "I can't do this anymore, Mark," Sophie said, her voice shaking but firm. "I need answers. Not just pieces of the truth, but the whole thing. You said you were honest with me, but I still don't know what you're hiding. I need you to tell me everything." Mark's face paled, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. He had promised her honesty, but the truth was complicated, tangled in a web of corruption, danger, and shame. He had already told her enough to destroy their relationship, but Sophie wasn't asking for more out of malice. She was asking for closure. She was asking for understanding. "I've told you everything I can," Mark said, his voice tight. "You know about the deals I made, the people I was working with. But I can't keep talking about it, Sophie. It's not just about me anymore. It's about our safety. I'm still in danger, and so are you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Are you saying you're still involved with them? After everything?" "No, it's not that," Mark quickly replied, standing up and walking towards her. "But they haven't forgotten about me. I've made a lot of enemies, Sophie. And those enemies don't just disappear. They don't forgive. You don't just walk away from that kind of world." Sophie's breath hitched in her throat. This wasn't what she had expected to hear. She had hoped for some kind of resolution, for a way to fix things, but Mark was saying that they were still in danger. That their lives were still at risk. "You mean we're still in danger?" Sophie repeated, her voice faltering. "After everything we've been through?" Mark nodded solemnly. "I'm trying to protect you, Sophie. I'm doing everything I can to get out, but I can't just walk away without repercussions. I made my choices, and now I have to live with the consequences. You have to understand that." Sophie felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The truth she had been avoiding for so long was now undeniable. Their lives were caught in a dangerous game, and there was no way out without risk. The man standing before her, the man she had loved, had put them both in a position where their safety, their future, was uncertain. Sophie's hands trembled as she wiped away a tear that threatened to fall. "So, what do we do now, Mark? What do you want me to do?" "I don't know yet," Mark replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But I'm not giving up on you. I won't. And I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Sophie looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of the man she once knew. She could see the desperation there, the deep sorrow and regret. But there was something else too. A coldness. An uncertainty. She wasn't sure if it was fear for her safety or fear that he had lost everything. Maybe both. "Do you really think I can just forget all of this?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forget everything you've done? All the lies? The manipulation?" Mark's face twisted with pain. "No, I don't think you can forget. I don't think I can forget either. But I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life making it right. I know it's too late to fix everything, but I can't lose you, Sophie. I just can't." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. For a long moment, Sophie didn't speak. She just stood there, wrestling with the conflict in her heart. She had never expected her life to end up like this, to be standing here, torn between the man she loved and the fear of what else he might still be hiding. "I need time, Mark," Sophie said, finally breaking the silence. "I need time to think about everything. To figure out if we, are even possible anymore." Mark looked devastated, but he nodded. "I understand. I'll give you all the time you need." The room seemed to shrink around them as Sophie turned away, her mind racing with questions, her heart still aching with confusion. She had never imagined a future like this. The man she had married was now a stranger, and the world she had built around them felt like it was crumbling into dust. How could she move forward when everything had been built on lies? As Sophie left the room, Mark sat back down at the desk, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. His mind wasn't on the documents, he didn't care about them anymore. His focus was on the woman he loved, the woman he had hurt. And he knew, deep down, that no matter how much he tried to protect her, he had already failed. But he wouldn't give up. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance to make things right. The days that followed Sophie's conversation with Mark felt like an eternity. Time dragged on, each moment a reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Sophie hadn't been able to shake the images of the life they had built together, the memories of laughter, love, and the quiet moments they had shared. But now, all of that seemed distant, as though it belonged to a different life altogether. She was unsure if she could ever trust Mark again, and even more unsure about what she would do if she could. Mark had given her the space she needed, but his absence didn't provide the clarity she had hoped for. Instead, it only made the uncertainty grow. Was he truly trying to change? Was he really ready to protect her from the world he had dragged them into, or was he just saying the right things to hold on to the one thing he couldn't lose? Sophie found herself spiraling into the same cycle of doubt. She couldn't escape the thought that there was more to Mark's story than he was letting on. And the constant fear that they were still being watched, still being hunted, weighed heavily on her. Mark had warned her countless times. They were both being followed, both under the radar of powerful, dangerous people who had never forgiven his betrayal. The fact that Mark was still trying to protect her, still trying to fight against the odds, spoke volumes to Sophie. But how much could she trust him now? That evening, after a long day of silence and unanswered questions, Sophie couldn't take it anymore. She had to know the truth, the full truth. She stood in the living room, looking at Mark, who was sitting on the couch, his hands resting on his knees. He looked tired, older, as though the weight of their situation was finally taking its toll on him. "We need to talk," Sophie said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I need you to tell me everything, Mark. I don't care how dark it gets. I can't keep living like this, in the dark, pretending everything's okay when it's not. Mark didn't look at her immediately. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, as though the weight of her words had caught him off guard. Finally, he met her gaze. Sophie, I've told you everything I can. There's nothing more I can say. Stop, Sophie snapped, her patience running thin. You keep saying that. But you're still holding something back, aren't you? Why won't you tell me the whole truth? Mark's face tightened. He didn't want to lie to her anymore. He didn't want to carry this burden alone any longer, but revealing too much would only put them both in even more danger. Sophie, he started, but she cut him off. No, Mark, she said, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and determination. I need to know everything. The whole truth. What happened with these people? What exactly did you do? You keep saying they're dangerous, that they want revenge, but I don't understand why. I don't know the full picture. Mark took a deep breath and stood up. He walked to the window and stared out at the dimly lit street below, as though searching for something in the darkness. Sophie could see the inner struggle in his eyes. He was fighting with himself, knowing that whatever he said next could change everything. I worked for a man named Jonas Carter, Mark began, his voice quiet but heavy. He runs one of the largest underground operations in the country: drugs, arms dealing, money laundering. You name it, they do it. I wasn't just working for him. I was one of his top men. I didn't have a choice, Sophie. I got involved when things were already too far gone. The money, the power, it seemed like the only way to survive. But then it got out of control. People started disappearing, and I realized just how dangerous it really was. Sophie's heart sank as she listened to him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit, but the picture was darker than she had imagined. But why, Mark? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep all of this from me? Mark ran his fingers through his hair, clearly struggling to keep his emotions in check. Because I didn't want you to be involved. I didn't want you to know the truth about me. I thought I could get out, that I could leave it all behind. But I couldn't. And now? Now it's too late. Sophie felt a rush of emotions flood her chest: anger, betrayal, fear, but there was something else, too. A deep, aching sadness for the man she had once trusted with everything. You're telling me that you were involved in all of this, Sophie said, her voice thick with disbelief. That you were working for these people, doing who knows what, and you thought I wouldn't find out? How could you hide this from me, Mark? I didn't know how to tell you, Mark whispered. I thought I was protecting you. But now I see how much I've hurt you. I don't know how to fix this, Sophie. I just don't. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sophie's mind raced as she processed everything Mark had just said. This wasn't just a case of a man making a mistake. This was a lifetime of lies, of dangerous decisions that had led them to this point. The stakes were higher than ever. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mark, Sophie said, her voice breaking. You've lied to me for so long, and now our lives are at risk because of it. I don't even know who you are anymore. Mark took a step toward her, but Sophie held up her hand to stop him. I need to think, she said, her voice low but resolute. I can't do this right now. Mark stood still, his eyes filled with regret. He knew there was nothing he could do to undo the damage. He had crossed a line, and Sophie was starting to realize that she couldn't just pretend everything was normal anymore. There were too many questions, too many dangers lurking in the shadows. He watched her walk away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the woman he loved might be slipping away from him. As Sophie retreated to the bedroom, she couldn't escape the sense of dread that had taken hold of her. The walls of their home felt too small, too confining, as though they were closing in on her. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer. their lives were still in danger, and Mark's past was far from over. No matter what he said, no matter how hard he tried to protect her, the threat was real, and it was closing in on them both. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she knew she had reached a crossroads. She had to make a choice, to walk away and leave Mark behind, or to stand by him and face the consequences of his past. But there was something else she had to consider. Was she strong enough to survive the storm that was coming? Could she truly protect herself, and the life they had built, when the very people Mark had betrayed were still watching? The answer was unclear. The future was uncertain. And as the minutes ticked by, Sophie knew that whatever decision she made next could be the one that would change everything. The night felt heavier than ever before. Sophie had never been more uncertain in her life. The words Mark had spoken echoed in her mind, twisting and turning like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, had just revealed that he was entangled in a dangerous world she never knew existed. And now, she was trapped in it too. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap as her thoughts spiraled. She had spent the entire night awake, too restless to sleep, too consumed by the truth Mark had revealed. How had it come to this? She had believed, for so long, that their lives were ordinary, safe, calm, and filled with love. But that was all a lie. Everything was a lie. Mark had tried to protect her, he said, but in the process, he had only put them both at risk. The world he had been a part of was far darker than she could have ever imagined. And the fact that it was now chasing them both was the harsh reality she could no longer escape. But as she sat in silence, Sophie couldn't ignore the flicker of something else. It was a feeling she had been suppressing all along, a strange sense of fear, yes, but also of deep betrayal, and something worse. A gnawing feeling that she had been complicit in her own ignorance. Maybe she had turned a blind eye to the signs. Maybe she had chosen not to ask the right questions, because she had been too in love with the life they had built. But it was all gone now, shattered by the weight of the truth. Sophie rose to her feet, pacing around the room. She had to make a decision. She had to choose a path, and it was no longer one of denial. The future that she had imagined had already been stolen from her, piece by piece, and it was time to face the consequences. The knock on the door startled her. It wasn't the first time they'd had a visitor at this hour, but it felt different this time. This time, it felt more urgent. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately glanced toward the bedroom window, where the shadows of the night seemed to press in from every angle. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's me." Mark's voice was strained, almost urgent. "We need to talk." Sophie hesitated. She wasn't sure what she wanted from him anymore. Did she want answers? Or did she simply want to know how to escape the nightmare they were both in? There was no easy solution. But there was something she could no longer deny: she still loved him. And that made it impossible to walk away. She opened the door, and Mark stepped in, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with a sense of urgency Sophie had never seen before. Something had changed in him. Something was different. "I can't keep running, Sophie," Mark said, his voice low but filled with an intensity that seemed to hang in the air. "They're closing in on us. I've tried to protect you, but there's only so much I can do. I don't know what will happen next, but I need you to know that I'm not giving up on you. I won't let them take you." Sophie's heart pounded. She knew what he was saying. She had known it for days now. This wasn't just about hiding. This wasn't about evading the people who were after them. This was about survival. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mark," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know who to trust. I don't know what's real anymore." Mark stepped closer, his hand gently reaching for hers. "I'm real, Sophie. I promise you, I'm real. Everything I've done, every choice I've made, it's been for you. But I can't fix this alone. I need you with me. I need you to believe in me, in us. The tears welled in Sophie's eyes, and she tried to blink them away. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to go back to the life they had, the life she had loved. But that life was gone. And she wasn't sure if anything at all, could bring it back. You say you've been protecting me, Sophie said, her voice a little more steady now. But how can I trust you? How can I trust anything you say after all this? Mark's expression faltered, and for the first time, Sophie saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. I know I've lied to you, Sophie. I know I've kept things from you. But I swear to you, everything I've done for you, for us. I didn't want you to get hurt. And I didn't want you to know the truth. But now I know I can't keep running from it. Sophie stood there in silence, her hand still in his. She could feel the weight of his words, the burden of what he was saying, pressing down on her. Mark had been living with this secret for so long, and now it was hers to carry, too. What do we do now? She whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Where do we go from here? Mark let out a long breath and stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. We leave. We disappear. I've set things in motion. We have a safe house. It's the only way. It's the only chance we have. Sophie looked at him, unsure whether to feel relief or terror. She had trusted him once, but this was different. This wasn't just about the love they had, it was about survival, and in that moment, she knew that survival meant something much deeper than she had ever imagined. How long do we have? She asked, her voice barely audible. Mark didn't answer right away. He stared at her for a moment, as though weighing the consequences of his next words. Not long, he said finally. The people I've been running from, they don't stop. They don't forgive. And they don't care who they hurt. We have to move fast. If we stay here any longer, we're both as good as dead. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The reality of their situation hit her like a punch to the gut. There was no escape from this. There was no going back to normal. The life she had once known was gone, and she was left with only one choice: fight or run. Where will we go? She asked, her voice trembling, but her resolve growing stronger with every passing second. Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Sophie without saying a word. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the hastily written address. It was a place far from their current location, a place she had never heard of. It didn't matter. At that moment, the only thing that mattered was escaping the hell they were trapped in. We leave tonight, Mark said. Pack your things. Everything. We can't afford to waste any time. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision she had just made, there was no turning back now. As she moved toward the bedroom to pack, she could hear Mark's footsteps behind her. She could feel him watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She knew this was the last chance. This was their moment to leave everything behind and start fresh, to escape the monsters that had been haunting them both for so long. But as she packed, a question lingered in her mind. What would it mean to truly escape? Could they ever truly run from the past? Could Sophie ever trust Mark again after everything he had hidden from her? She didn't know the answers. But one thing was certain, this was it. This was the moment that would define everything. The hours leading up to their departure felt like an eternity. Sophie's hands trembled as she packed the last of her things, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag with a sense of urgency she couldn't fully understand. It wasn't the clothes or the items she was taking with her that made her nervous, it was the weight of the decision. The weight of leaving everything behind. She glanced around the house one last time. This house had been home for so long. The walls had witnessed their laughter, their arguments, their quiet moments of contentment. Now, they stood like silent sentinels, bearing witness to the end of their story. Sophie could almost feel the house whispering a farewell. But there was no turning back. She couldn't afford to stay. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her out of her reverie. "Sophie, we need to go now." His words, filled with a raw urgency, sent a chill down her spine. The time had come. No more second chances. No more hesitation. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice was strained. She threw the bag over her shoulder and walked toward the front door, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of the future. Mark stood in the doorway, looking at her with a mixture of fear and determination. "I won't let anything happen to you. We're getting out of this together." Sophie nodded, her throat tight. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She didn't know if she could trust Mark with her life. But she had no choice. She couldn't stay here, couldn't keep running from the truth that had caught up with them both. The car was parked at the end of the driveway, engine running, headlights casting long shadows in the darkness. Mark had already started the car, but he waited for Sophie to get in first. She hesitated for a moment, looking over her shoulder at the house one last time. It felt surreal, like stepping out of one life and into another. When she climbed into the car, Mark immediately slammed the door behind her, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. Sophie could feel the tension in his body, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. He was scared. And it made her even more terrified. They drove in silence, the hum of the car's engine the only sound filling the space between them. The road stretched out in front of them, dark and empty. It felt like they were driving into oblivion, leaving everything they knew behind. Sophie couldn't stop thinking about what Mark had said earlier, that they were being hunted. It felt like a terrible dream, a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The fear she had been carrying for days now consumed her, gnawing at her insides. Would they make it to the safe house? Or would they be caught before they even had a chance to escape? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Sophie glanced out the window at the passing scenery, the world outside seeming to blur together in a haze of fear and confusion. The silence between them was suffocating. She had so many questions, but the words felt trapped in her throat. Could she still trust Mark? Could she ever trust him again after everything he had hidden from her? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mark broke the silence. "They're still following us," he said, his voice low and tense. Sophie's stomach dropped. She turned to look at him, her heart racing. "What do we do?" Mark's jaw tightened as he gripped the steering wheel harder. "We keep going. We don't stop. If we stop, it's over." Sophie nodded, trying to push the panic back down. There was no room for fear now. They couldn't afford it. The road ahead grew darker, the trees on either side casting long shadows over the car. Sophie could feel the weight of every mile they put between themselves and the life they had known. It was all so surreal. She couldn't believe they were really doing this. Couldn't believe she was leaving behind everything, the house, the safety, the stability. But as the minutes ticked by, the feeling of dread only intensified. Sophie kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights behind them, chasing them down. But it wasn't until they reached a secluded stretch of road that the worst happened. The headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter by the second. They were being followed. Sophie's heart raced as she gripped the seat. "They're catching up." Mark's expression didn't change. He pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the car to its limits. "They won't catch us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." But Sophie knew that wasn't enough. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her mind racing with possibilities. They were running out of time. The car behind them wasn't backing off. It was getting closer, closer with every passing second. Sophie's hands clenched into fists, her body tensing as the panic started to set in. They couldn't outrun them forever. "Mark, what if we can't make it?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "What if we don't get to the safe house?" Mark's grip tightened on the wheel, but he didn't look at her. "We'll make it. I won't let them get to us." But Sophie knew better. She knew that there were some things even Mark couldn't control. They were up against forces that didn't play by the rules, forces that were beyond anything they could understand. The car behind them was almost on top of them now. The headlights were blinding, and the sound of tires screeching filled the air as the car behind swerved to overtake them. Mark slammed his foot down on the accelerator, but it was too late. The car behind them was closing in, the gap narrowing with every second. Without warning, the car swerved, cutting them off. Mark swerved in response, but it was too dangerous. The road was narrow, and the cars were too close. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. "Mark, get us out of here!" Sophie cried, her voice rising in panic. But Mark was already reacting. He turned the steering wheel sharply, the car veering off the road and onto the gravel shoulder. The tires screeched, but Mark managed to keep the car under control, narrowly avoiding a crash. "Hold on!" Mark shouted, his voice strained. Sophie's heart was pounding in her chest. She gripped the seat as the car jolted forward, swerving and bouncing over the uneven ground. The car behind them wasn't giving up, it was still right on their tail. They had to get away. They had to escape. Mark's foot slammed down harder on the gas pedal, the car hurtling forward with a deafening roar. The trees and brush on either side of them blurred as they sped down the winding road. Sophie could feel the weight of every second, every mile that brought them closer to the safe house. But she knew they were running out of time. The road ahead suddenly opened up, and Sophie saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. The safe house. They were so close. But would they make it? She glanced back, and her stomach twisted. The car behind them was still following. They were only a few hundred yards away now, and Sophie could see the shadows of figures inside. They were getting closer. Mark's voice cut through the fear. "We're almost there. Hold on." The safe house was just ahead. Sophie's eyes fixed on the light shining through the trees. She could feel the rush of hope rising in her chest. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The car behind them swerved violently, and Sophie's heart dropped. There was a flash of metal. One of the pursuers had a gun. Sophie screamed as the sound of gunfire echoed through the night.